Eighth graders, welcome back. Last time we were together, we were learning about the civil rights movement. We talked about the Montgomery bus boycott beginning the entire civil rights movement, but we also said that there were many events that happened before that, like the Baton Rouge bus boycott. Today, we're going to continue to look at the civil rights movement, looking mostly at school integration, which means desegregating schools. We know that schools used to be separated by races, and integration is when we begin to mix those races together. If you have not already, please pause the video and finish your do now. And let's review. So question number 1 says, according to the timeline above, what likely caused the Great Migration in 1910? So before you check and change your answer, don't forget the Great Migration is the time period when Black Americans living in the South began to move to the North and West coasts of America. And we know they were doing that because they were facing tremendous racism in the South. So with that information, check and change your answer as this pops up on your screen. And let's review. So the reason why the Great Migration happened around 1910, and we see that right around here, we could use our prior knowledge, but we can also use the timeline. Everything that comes above the Great Migration right here are things that have happened before the Great Migrations. We know the earliest events are here at the top, and then as we move down, we get closer to the present. So the reason why the Great Migration happened was C. Racial tensions caused by sharecropping, poll taxes, and racist organizations pushed them out of the South. The next question says, how many years did the progressive movement last? I'm going to give you a couple clues on how to find this. So the way that you find the right answer is you find the stop date, then you find the start date, and you subtract those two numbers. So we see that the progressive movement ends here on this date, and then we look for when it begins. It begins right here. So subtract 1890 from 1920. And let's review. So how many years did it last? It lasted for 30 years. 1920 minus 1890 is 30 years. For the next question, we wanted to figure out which of the following statements is true. Now, the best way to do this is to go through each of these options and check them against the timeline. If the timeline proves that this statement is false, then cross it off. So a reminder, though, about what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments did. The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. The 14th Amendment said that states could not take away the rights of citizens. And the 15th Amendment said that all men, regardless of color, had the right to vote. So keeping that in mind, read through each of these options and make sure you've chosen the statement that is true, that it's proven on this timeline. All right, let's check and change. The correct answer was A. Louisiana adopted the poll tax around the same time African Americans were given the right to vote. So the way we would find this is we look here, we see LA adopts poll tax, and we also see that happens at the 15th Amendment. And we just remembered the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote. And so what we should be taking from here to kind of keep that story of history going is the United States government says, hey, everyone now has the right to vote. And what Louisiana did that same year was say, well, we'll then adopt something called the poll tax, which is going to take away the right to vote from poor Black people. So even though it's now illegal to tell them they can't vote, we're going to have this rule that makes it much harder for them to vote. All right, flip to your historian hustle. You have 4 minutes to answer. Press next when you have answered all of your questions on your paper. And let's review. These hustle questions come straight from your test that you're taking this week. So you're taking your unit test. If you study these hustle questions, you'll do a lot better on your unit test. Number 1 is Higgins boats. Those were made in Louisiana. Number 2 is manufacture. Number 3 is urban, and urban is a city, and rural is country. Number 5 is Great Depression. 6 is Napoleon. He was a dictator of France. Number 7 is corruption. Number 8 is share our wealth. So this was a plan by Huey Long. It never actually was able to happen, though. Number 9 is segregation. 10 is the school desegregation crisis. 11 is the progressive movement. 12 is the Baton Rouge bus boycott. 13 is Catholicism or Catholic. The Catholic religion was the religion of the French and Spanish, and also the religion of the Italians and the Irish who came. 14 is civil disobedience, and 15 is revolution. So flip your papers over now and write on your paper, what do you think makes a person brave? So there are a lot of different things that you can write here, and this is a personal question. We could talk about people being brave if they are someone like a soldier or a firefighter who put their lives on the line to protect others. We could talk about bravery as being someone who stands up for another person who can't do it, or just someone who does something challenging. Today we're going to look at a little girl alive during the civil rights movement and ask ourselves, do we think the actions that she took were brave? So our compelling question for the day is, was Ruby Bridges brave? We're going to learn that Ruby Bridges was the first Black student to attend an all-white school in New Orleans. We'll learn more about that, her actions, and what it was like for her, and figure out if we've decided that we think she's brave. Write down today's aim. Today we will be able to explain the impact Brown versus Board of Education had on education in the South. All right. So, following the Civil War, nearly all schools in the South were segregated. To be segregated means they were separated by race. This means that if you were to go back in time in New Orleans and look at the schools, you would either attend a school that is all white or a school that is all black. They did not have schools that mixed the races. The laws so this was supported by law. There was a law that said that we could separate or segregate schools as long as they were separate but equal. The idea being you can separate the races as long as both races have access to equally good schools or equally good facilities. However, the reality is Black children often went to schools that were overcrowded and underfunded. And so here we see a couple of examples. Here's an auditorium where people would go to see like plays and performances. This was the Farmville High School auditorium, and then this was the Morton High School auditorium. Farmville was an all-white school, whereas Moton, was an all-black school. So we see some discrepancies there where one is getting a lot more, looks a lot nicer than the other. And here are two schools in Louisiana. Up on the top left is an all-black school, and the bottom is an all-white school. We see some differences in how the funding that these schools are getting. One is definitely getting a lot more funding than the other. And so in America, not every state had segregated schools. We see here red means that it was required that schools were segregated. We also see that there were some states in the country with this green that did say it was forbidden to separate schools by race. So not all of America was segregated, but definitely the South was a very segregated area. And because we know that these schools were not separate and equal, people begin to challenge this in court. Brown versus Board of Education is the name of a lawsuit. A man with the last name of Brown sued the Board of Education in his hometown of Topeka, Kansas. He said, "It is not fair that my child has to attend the black school because the black school is not as fair and not as equal as the white school in my area." This court case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and we've learned that when the Supreme Court rules on something, that ruling affects the entire country. The Supreme Court ended up ruling that separate but equal was not fair because it was not equal. Therefore, they said that it is illegal to mandate that schools be segregated. So, we would think that if the Supreme Court has said we must integrate schools, you cannot keep your school segregated, you would think that all of America would suddenly be this green, like we see here, where the schools are just all integrated. Black and white students go together. However, that's not really the case. It took a really long time for schools to begin to be integrated or desegregated. Here we see this is the news article after school segregation was banned. This right here is the daughter of the man who sued the school district so that she could go to school. And here she is sitting at where the Supreme Court meets with the newspaper saying that the segregation has been banned. So that was 1955. 5 years later, New Orleans has 4 Black first graders integrate schools for the first time. So for the first time, Black students are beginning to attend white schools. One of them was Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was sent to an all-white school because she was excelling at the school that she was at. But because they were so underfunded, her parents were worried that she was not going to get the kind of education that would allow her to have opportunities. These 3 of the 4 women, the first graders who, sorry, 3 of the 4 women who integrated schools in New Orleans are still alive today. And so here's a picture of them. Ruby Bridges is also still alive today. So we would think that a first grader being allowed to go to an all-white school to get the best education she can would be welcomed by people. Unfortunately, many of the white families at this school and then just other white people around the city protested this. They were hoping to boycott integrated schools. So families threatened to take their kids out of the school. They came when Ruby Bridges showed up with posters and signs. They were shouting. You can see this little girl holding a sign saying, "We want to keep our school white." It was even backed, this protest, by a man named Judge Perez. He was a judge in St. Bernard Parish. Today, he is honored by having a street named after him. And so, that's a little disconcerting. This is a painting by a man named Norman Rockwell. It's a painting of what it was like for Ruby Bridges to go to school, and we see tomatoes being thrown in the background. We see racial slurs written on the wall, and we see that she needed U.S. Marshals to help escort her because the people protesting became so violent. So the fallout of this, Ruby Bridges did attend this school, and she did graduate from it. And then more schools began to become integrated. So after Ruby Bridges kind of broke that seal for others, other Black children began to integrate white schools. As a result, white families began looking for all-white private schools in the city and in surrounding suburbs. So as a result, the schools in New Orleans never fully integrated. As more Black children began to attend the white schools, the white children just left the schools. And this trend was seen across this country. Southern schools were integrated, but they were met with resistance, and ultimately white families would pull their children out of integrated schools. And so even though Ruby Bridges did many incredible and world-changing things for our city reacted in a really poor way. So this right here is just a map showing where the blue dots represent schools that have mostly white people in it, and the black dots indicate mostly Black people. We can see our city is still pretty segregated. We've got a lot of white people living along in this area, and then a lot of Black people clustered together over in this area. So even though we've made some strides, New Orleans still has a really long way to go. All right, you have 4 questions. Write them on your paper. All right, and let's check and change. What were segregated schools like? They were separated by race, and generally the Black students did not have as many opportunities as the white students. What does it mean to desegregate? So if segregate means to separate, desegregate means to do the opposite, so to bring Black and white students together. And a synonym for that is to integrate. So desegregation and integration are synonyms. They mean the same thing. What happens when schools were desegregated in Louisiana? People protested, and ultimately white families took their kids out of public schools. And then, do you think the effects of school desegregation crisis are still felt in New Orleans today? Yeah, we still see New Orleans as a very segregated city. All right, so flip to your document analysis. We're still trying to answer this question, though, about Ruby Bridges. So all of our documents will focus on her, and we want to know, was she brave? And we want to find reasons to support why she was or why she was not. So source one, we have a timeline. And the questions that we want to answer when we answer this timeline are one, what needed to happen before Ruby Bridges could desegregate her public school? And then number two, was school desegregation successful through the actions of a single individual, through one person? Remember, to desegregate means to bring the races together. So use this timeline to answer those two questions. All right, let's review. So number one, what needed to happen before Ruby Bridges could desegregate her public school? You should have looked onto your timeline and found, when is Ruby Bridges desegregating? It's happening here in 1960. So what has to happen before then? Well, if we go to the very first event, first we need the court case that says that the federal government is mandating that you cannot have segregated schools. So first we need that court case. And then if I keep going, I see some other things. I see that there was a poll where public opinion is starting to say that people believe that schools should be desegregated. We see that a university has a Black student attend it. We see that a school in Little Rock, Arkansas is integrated. So we're seeing a lot of different people doing different things. A court case happens, public opinion is starting to change, people are desegregating other schools. There was a march in support of integration, and then another march that was even bigger. So what needed to happen? There needed to be the Supreme Court case, and there also needed to be a change in public opinion, and that happened through other people helping to desegregate schools and through these marches and rallies that were being held. And then number two, was school desegregation successful through the actions of a single individual? I said no. It took lawsuits and many different people from around the country desegregating schools and marching in support of integration. All right, we're going to watch an interview. Before we do, let's check and think about the questions that we want to answer. Number one is, why do you think Ruby Bridges is still giving interviews today? Number two, what was significant about Ruby Bridges joining her new school? And then number three, based on this interview, do you think Ruby Bridges is brave? So we're going to watch an interview of Ruby Bridges and answer these questions.
Please welcome Ruby Bridges. So here you are, this little 6-year-old. You get ready to go to first grade, you're all excited like little kids get. Do your parents say, baby, there's a little something we have to explain to you before we take you? Do you understand what they're telling you at the time?
Well, actually, it'd be very, very hard for a parent to explain to their 6-year-old what they're about to venture into. So no, my parents didn't say a thing to me other than, you're going to go to a new school today and you better behave. And really, that was the extent of it. You know, I'd already attended a couple of months of first grade. Because the laws didn't change in September, this happened in November. So I knew I was switching schools, but I had no idea that I was going to a white school.
When you're walking down that row and these grown folks are yelling and spitting and cussing, do you have any idea what did you think was happening?
Well, living in New Orleans, I'm accustomed to Mardi Gras. You know, Mardi Gras is a huge celebration, and they're throwing things, and they're screaming, and police are everywhere. And so I remember getting into the car with the 4 federal marshals and driving this very short drive to my new school. But the minute we turned the corner, I saw exactly what you just saw on screen, what you were explaining. And I thought it was Mardi Gras. I thought, we've stumbled into a parade. That's what it looked like. And my mother, didn't bother to explain to me what was really going on. So I was never really afraid. I remember them saying, explaining to us how to get out of the car, how to walk. Ruby, walk straight ahead and don't look back. And they rushed me inside of the building.
For 6 years old, I mean, I'm just amazed at your bravery. You saw those riots outside, and you were ostracized, you were isolated. You say you weren't afraid, but how did you cope? You were just 6.
I knew that the school was different because I was the only child in the whole school. That first day when I went in, they walked me up the stairs into the principal's office, and then all of the people that you saw outside, they rushed back in. And I remember them passing the office where I was sitting. Federal marshals were standing outside, and they were screaming and pointing, and they seemed really angry, but I didn't know why. As a matter of fact, this is going to be really funny, but, we had to be tested. There was a search, a door-to-door search, and people volunteered their 6-year-old kids. But the opposition set up a test to eliminate those kids. And so there were only 6 kids chosen. So I heard all of my neighbors, my family, oh, she's so smart, she passed the test. So I actually thought that day all of the commotion was because I was so smart, I was going to college.
Well, that was good.
That's amazing.
That was how quick, yeah.
What do you think of race relations today? I don't know if you heard some of those statistics that they're down.
I was backstage and I did hear that. It is very disheartening for me because of my history, because of the sacrifices my parents made, sacrifices Dr. King made, so many people, both black and white, that we are where we are today. I feel a little bit differently because I believe the issue is it's more than just the color of our skin. I believe that it's good and evil, to be honest with you. I really do. I mean, I know it's a lot about have and have-nots, but it's deeper than that. It's good and evil.
You think people can be evil?
Oh, definitely. I think when you have a person that goes into a church and sits with people for an hour and then you end up shooting 9 of them, that's evil.
Yes.
That person...
I'm in school for painting, so to know that your history is memorialized in a Norman Rockwell painting that I had to study for magical proportions, let alone what it really meant. How did it feel to know that this is you?
I did not see that painting until I was about 19. And the truth of the matter is that all of this happened in New Orleans. It was swept under the rug. No one really wanted to talk about it. It was over and done with. The movement went on. I was then being raised by a single parent, and so they were consumed with where our next meal was going to come from. My parents were not activists. And so a reporter came by one day when I was 18 and said, look at this. Do you understand that this is you? And up until that point, I felt like it was something that just happened in my community, my city. Didn't realize that it was a major event that changed history.
How did you know that? You were a child.
Exactly. I did not know that.
All right. So, using that interview, answer questions 1 through 3.
Welcome back to the 2. When I walk into a house and smell something delicious, bacon in the oven, I feel like I'm home.
All right, and let's review. So we got to see Ruby Bridges in a recent interview. Why do you think that Ruby Bridges is still giving interviews today? I thought that it's because racism still exists today. She didn't finish fighting that fight of racism when she was a little girl. It's still ongoing, and so she's still working to fight against it. Number 2, what was significant about Ruby Bridges joining her new school? It was that she was the first Black student to attend her all-white school. She helped begin desegregation in New Orleans. And then finally, number 3, based on this interview, do you think that Ruby Bridges is brave? I put yes, and I put it's because she chose to go to a school that had people who were from different backgrounds from her and looked different. She endured poor treatment from many of the students and their families. All right, source number 3 has that Norman Rockwell painting that they talked about in the interview. So your questions are, why do you think that Norman Rockwell painted this image, and do you think it accomplishes its goals? What is this image showing? And based on this image, do you think that Ruby Bridges is brave? Answer your questions on your paper. All right, let's review. So why do you think he painted this image? He wanted to show the cruel treatment and racism that Black children like Ruby Bridges faced when desegregating schools. I think I didn't put it on here, but I think it did help accomplish his goal of showing that. I think he also is trying to fight against racism, and it is something that's helping to fight, but that fight is still ongoing. So literally, what is this image showing? It's showing Ruby Bridges escorted by men who are from the National Guard, bringing her to school. Tomatoes and racial slurs are shown on the walls. And then based on this image, do you think that Ruby Bridges is brave? I put yes. This image shows Ruby Bridges facing cruel treatment to attend school. This is something that most people do not have to endure just to go to school. And finally, your last source is an actual excerpt from Ruby Bridges' autobiography. So these are her words about what it was like attending her second day of school. Read the source and then answer the questions. Let's review. So number 7, who wrote this source and why is that important to know? It's Ruby Bridges, and that's important because it's a primary source. It gives us an inside look at what Ruby Bridges was thinking and experiencing when she went to that all-white school in New Orleans. Number 8, what was Ruby's second day of school like? She taught alone in a separate room, or was taught alone in a separate room, and she was not allowed to mix with the other children during lunch or recess. Even if she had to go to the bathroom, she had to get a National Guards person to walk her. And then why were there other children not in class with Ruby? It's because those children's families disagreed with desegregating the school or integrating the school. So there was still a lot of racism that Ruby faced, even though she had integrated a school. Based on this excerpt, do you think that Ruby Bridges is brave? I put yeah. Despite being mistreated by students and their families and being forced to attend class alone, she continued to go to school because she wanted a good education. All right, your exit ticket is in Illuminates. You can keep your sources out and use them. Go to Unit 3, Day 11 exit ticket, School Integration. All right, I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.